Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Conversations in Pop Culture. I have with me Xane Daniel, who is the author of Righteous, which is a graphic novel. It's a very interesting graphic novel. So, welcome to the show. I'm super excited to have you on.
Oh, thanks. I'm super excited to be on.
And hopefully, I didn't mess up the name yet, because that's
You
the only
got you
thing I'm
got
nervous about
everything
right
right.
now.
You got it all right. Yep. Yeah, even with that complicated, strange spelling of my first name, you got it.
For those who don't know, his name is spelled with an X and not a Z, even though it sounds like it's spelled with a Z. So, I just want to throw that
Right.
out there, which I
Yep.
think is kind of
Every
cool.
once in a while someone calls me Xane or they're not quite sure what to say. Yeah. So I get it.
So, you have an interesting graphic novel, but before we get into it, I'm very curious about your background because you have, in many ways, an even more interesting background as you did not come from the comic realm directly and you had an entire career in video game production work. And I'm not going to make you break any NDAs or anything like that, but I'm very curious how you even got into that sector before we dive into the graphic novel world.
Okay, sure. So when I was a kid, my grandfather he was in World War II, and after World War II, he went to work as a chemist, and he worked for the U.S. government, and he worked on triggers for the H bomb in the 50s. So I was surrounded by technology as a child. So my grandfather was a chemist, my father an electrical engineer, another electrical engineer on the other side of the family. So it was all around me. And really, when my grandfather in the late 70s, early 80s took me under his wing and taught me how to program a computer, I fell in love with that because I loved the idea of making my own video games. Because I was a video gamer as a kid. You know, the Atari 2600 came out in the 80s. So that was totally my thing. And I loved it so much that as soon as he taught me how to program, all I wanted to do with it is make games. And so that's pretty much what I did my entire childhood. Like I just made games on my own. I always got people together to do different types of gaming activities. So I often, was kind of like the leader of the group. So, get all these people together and we're going to play D&D or we're going to, play some video game together as a group or whatever. So those two things actually put me in a great position to be a producer in the video game industry because I had to be a leader as a producer, and of course, my understanding of programming and my understanding of video games themselves. And so I was a producer for 22 years. That ended in 2018, and I got to work on a lot of different titles. Hunter the Reckoning. I worked on one of the Saints Row series. I even worked on Mortal Kombat 10. So, lots of different games of different popularity, like a Leisure Suit Larry game, Dora the Explorer. So, it was quite diverse, and they all were fantastic in their own ways. They were all fun, and even the Dora the Explorer game, like I was a big gamer at the time when we got that, and I was like, oh man, nobody's going to want to work on that. And they said, hey, do you want to work on that? And I went, yeah, sure. And really what was great about it is that every game offers its own challenges. And so when you're making a game for 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds, they can't read. So your entire user interface goes out the window. Because, obviously to select play game or what level you're going to play on, you have to read the instructions on the screen, the text. So it was really fun to kind of come up with a way to do that without using text on the screen. So, and I even worked on Oculus Rift titles, and that's a different type of challenge altogether of trying to figure out how to communicate to the player and not move too much because it makes people throw up and things like that. So, I just got an opportunity to work on some really amazing titles that I mostly enjoyed all the way up until the end.
And then from there, you kind of had a shift to writing your first comic series, Righteous. So
Hmm.
just to backtrack a little, give a little context, as we're making a little bit of a jump here. Righteous, I believe, has 14 issues out, or the 14th
Correct.
issue is going to be out relatively soon, and the story goes on from there. But I
Hmm.
don't know. I don't know what's going on with COVID-19. I'm going to get to that in probably towards the end of this interview. But what was the impetus to make that jump and go in that direction? Because to go from video games, while they're the same, they're cousins in the medium world as far as pop culture, but
Right.
they're also very different from a writing standpoint and even how they're read. Because a comic book can be read in any speed the user wants to read it, while a video game, for the most part, has to be played at a certain speed, and that medium dictates that speed that the user plays, or sometimes it's third person over the shoulder versus first
Mhm.
person. So, what was
Right.
that transition like?
Yeah, that was interesting, and really, I was starting to kind of lose interest in video games, and it all started because I was working on Mortal Kombat. And if you know anything about Mortal Kombat 10, oh, really, the Mortal Kombat series in general, the whole thing is just about brutality and outdoing themselves. So they always had to outdo themselves for every iteration. And by the time you get to Mortal Kombat 10, that if Mortal Kombat 1 has a critical hit where you rip the spine out of your opponent, then you've got to go a long way on Mortal Kombat 10 to make it over the top enough to continue to generate the fandom that series generated. So we did things like zooming in with an X-ray camera during a critical hit so that you could actually see the bone shards on the inside of the body and then the character screaming in agony. And I was kind of realizing at this point that I didn't really like this so much. That my passion for making video games was more about the game and not so much about the types of things that we were teaching people to like. And so I started to kind of question what the heck I was doing. Um, and so it was an easier transition when it comes to saying I don't really want to participate in that sort of mm, negative influence on society. And and yes, while I was working on video games, there were many games that had story associated with it, and we had great writers that were working on the various games. Like the Hunter the Reckoning writer was fantastic, and we did some things that no game had done at that point. And so I was familiar with the storytelling aspect. And even though, like you say, the speed is different and so forth, a cutscene happens, and we don't care what happens in between the cutscene. It could take them 2 hours or it could take them 2 minutes. It doesn't really matter. Once the cutscene begins, it's still a linear story. So from that perspective, I still got the idea of how to do that. And even though I wasn't necessarily a writer on the stories, I was very involved with that process and got to see the construction of a story from many different angles. So and I'd always been a bit of a writer on the side myself, so I had a passion for it anyway. So then when it came time to make this comic book, and okay, so I didn't make a comic book because I love comic books. I do enjoy comic books a lot, and as a kid, I definitely loved them. And then I read Robert Kirkman's Walking Dead comic book,
Great, great
and
comic. Great comic.
and Invincible, and
That's
they're
another
just
good one.
both so well done. They really broke the mold of what comics do. They told a story in a different way, not an episodic way, but in just this long, ongoing story concept. He was not afraid to make giant changes to the world and then have everybody have to react to that. There was just a lot of innovation. He loved the epiphany, and so his characters have epiphanies, which you don't see in entertainment very often. So I really did appreciate all those aspects of it, and so I went, okay, this concept has come to me, and what way am I going to portray it? I could make, I could write a novel. Well, the problem with writing a novel is I've never really done that before. Not like I'd written comic books before either, but there's a challenge to it from the writing standpoint and a challenge from the reading standpoint. If I write a novel and I say, "Hey, could you read my novel?" Someone's going to go, "Yeah, right." Like I don't have time for that. But if I say, "Hey, I've got a comic book. Do you want to read my comic book?" Yeah, well, yeah, that only takes 5 minutes to read a comic book. So sure, I got time to do that. And so I kind of like that aspect of that medium. I also like it because, you were talking about speed. If you think about all the entertainment mediums, the fastest medium to absorb entertainment is comic books. A movie, you have to wait for people to speak out loud, which is slower than when you read. In a movie, you have to do pans and cuts and show the environment and show the passage of time. In a comic book, you don't have to do that. You just turn the page. In a novel, you're describing all this detail. The snow was gently falling and sticking to the tree limbs and blah, blah, blah. Like you get all this description, right? Which is great, but that takes longer to read. The little text box, the little dialogue box. And so you're able to zip right through. So that I liked for the ability to get across my story as quickly as possible. And so then to maybe take the next question out of your mouth, where did the idea for Righteous come from? And that was, okay, so it's 2016, and we have ourselves a presidential election going on. We have, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump and Clinton, right? And I was kind of laissez-faire about the whole thing because I just went, whatever, I don't know what's going on with these people. But then I started to research Bernie Sanders. And what I found really fascinating about that is that every time he was interviewed, and you could go back and see like times where he's in Congress, right, in the 80s or in the 90s, and he's banging his fist on the table and looking like a complete crazy person, going, this is not the way that we should do things for the people and stuff like that. And you could even see the other Congress people just like, oh my gosh, would this old guy just shut up, right? Like we don't want to hear this anymore. And that's when I realized that this guy really is just trying to do what's right. He's trying to really help the people. Unlike the rest of politics, where they're just trying to help themselves get elected, this guy didn't care whether he was elected or not, didn't care anything, just thought, there's a way that you should do this, and there's a way we shouldn't do this. And what all you guys want to do is the wrong way. So I found that really fascinating, and I started to imagine, like, what would it be like if all the Congress people all of a sudden just thought the same way that Bernie Sanders did? If you just snap your fingers and they were all just like, oh yeah, we should just help the people. and all of a sudden you would see a very different sort of situation. You'd see them actually working together. You'd see them trying to solve the actual problems for the benefit of the people instead of the benefit of themselves, instead of the benefit of the constituents and the lobbyists and all that crap. If they just said, all that stuff is junk, we don't care, all we care about is the people, what would that look like? And then I started to think, well, if we could do that in our US government, what if we did that for every single human being on the planet? What if every single person one day woke up and all they wanted to do was help each other? What would that look like? And so I actually started writing little short stories. They were one-page comic pages of that morning, the wake-up morning where everyone is convinced that all they want to do is help each other. And they go to work and they're kind of confused about what's going on, and they're shocked and surprised that everyone else feels the same way. And then the world transforms in 24 hours. The news media goes, what are we doing? We're lying to the people. We got to stop that. And we're just sensationalizing everything. This is dumb. The CEO of Walmart goes, we don't need all this money just for ourselves. I bet you we've got more power than anybody in the world, probably, at least high up there. So what if we just decided to feed all the people on the planet? And down to the normal everyday person, there's a huge line outside of the Red Cross because everybody's lined up to donate blood. So then that was kind of cool. But the problem with it was that there was no conflict. Like, okay, everybody just agrees. So that doesn't really make a good story. So then I said, okay, what if we could get there one person at a time? And what if just one person one day woke up with the just completely convinced that he needs to help everybody? So the concept is simply, we have a greedy corporate analyst who has a supernatural event occur where he has to help other people and he can't just make money for himself anymore. And he starts to do that and realizes that he's completely now incompatible with society. He is going to lose his job. He's probably going to lose his wife and his house and everything that he's built up to this point. And all he can do is run around and help people. So what the heck now? How is this all going to go? And so I get to introduce one twist, which is that every time he helps someone, they get it too. So now he is actually spreading this need, this desire, this belief that everyone should just help everyone, and they're all forced to do it as well. And then we're off and running.
So I want to unpack this because I think this is fascinating. And one of the things that I like about this, and I don't know if this was intentional, but we get that struggle to that point where one of the things that when you look at this book and you first attempt and say, okay, let me read the back and see what it's about, and you flip through, you're like, oh, there would be no conflict. And what I find to be the conflict is that he is slowly losing, and he's kind of going from a very high point down into a valley.
Right.
And we see that down on the ticker. And I don't know if that was intentional, but that's what I see, that it's initially not working. Where we get the disease is working because we see people slowly change, but we don't see the result that it's intending, or that what you're intending to happen in this story. So
right.
What was that like? Because it's very interesting because you're achieving, the way I view it, because I've been in a situation where it's like I'm failing in one area and I'm achieving success in the exact opposite. And it's an extremely frustrating position. And anybody who's ever been there knows exactly what that's like. And that's what I got out of this book immediately, because I read the first volume, for those why I'm referring to, which is, I believe, the first 4 or 5 issues.
First 5 chapters, yep.
Chapters. Is perfect. Yep. So that's why I'm referring to it as a book, but it's the first 5 chapters.
Issues. So yeah.
What was that entire thing to play like with that?
Well, I mean, it just happened very naturally, because by just having one person have this happen to them, then it's almost like I could just let it play out. Like I didn't even have to decide what was going to happen so much as, okay, put person in situation he can only help. Oh, he helps a homeless person. He drags him into his office and says, here, have some donuts and have some coffee. And then he comes up with the idea, oh my gosh, I should make sure that you get shaved up and cleaned up, and I'm going to give you some money, and I'm going to try to get you a job. And you just can't help it. You're just in this helping mode, right? So as that starts to happen, and he works for kind of a dastardly corporate job, right, where they're trying to decide, between people's lives and money, and if people die, as long as we make enough money, it's okay. And so then he's going, well, this is horrific, right? I can't keep doing this thing that and that's the other thing to get across, is that this character was exceptional at his job. He was the top of his game, and his bosses loved him, and he loved his job, and he loved doing exactly what he was doing. He loved the idea of, he says, I'm going to take over the world, because he knows he's just going to keep going up and up and up. So to have this kind of transformation happen to somebody of that kind of caliber, it wasn't like somebody who was going to lose their job anyway. No, this was somebody who had a lot to lose. So that's a great experience. And what's really fun is that when this has been going on for 4 years now, right? And that the first 5 chapters came out within, in 2016 and early 2017. And I had people that were reading it, and they were telling me, this is going to sound completely crazy, but I just went into my CEO's office because I realized we were doing some practices that were a little bit underhanded, or we were cheating somebody or whatever, and I didn't like it. And so I went into the CEO's office and said, I don't think that this is a good practice. And this one person that I'm thinking of in particular, she said to me, I couldn't believe I was channeling a comic book as I went in and I talked to my CEO. And to her happiness and surprise, the CEO said, you know what, you're right, and decided to make a change. So that's the thing that I loved about it at first, was this opportunity for even readers to go and make changes in their life, because it becomes so clear and obvious. We're just so used to following our capitalistic society and doing what the boss says that we don't realize that, wait a minute, maybe what we're doing is not so good for other people. And maybe we should stop and think about that for a second and see if we can decide that our morals maybe can be stronger than our need for money.
And to bring up a point that sort of counters this in the book, and I think it's a really good thing to bring up, is that there is a moment in this book that sort of touches upon this idea that helping can be too much sometimes. And I think, the little part with the suicide prevention situation in that. And I don't know, that was very interesting, because here we have somebody who's helping and can't help and stop helping, but that help almost was a step too far. And what was that like? Because that's very interesting to have. We're seeing this helping, and he's really saving. I think the homeless guy's name is Greg, from my memory, I want to say.
Yep. Greg is a homeless guy. He's not the one committing suicide, though.
Yeah, he's not the one committing suicide, but the guy is about to jump just to set the stage. And Daniel's going on I think it's Daniel, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I have a good memory. I'm nervous, everybody. I'm a bit nervous. And it's been a long day. It's been a long day for me on my side, but the guy is about to jump off a bridge, and Daniel is going to the ballet with his wife, or the orchestra with his wife, and he stops and he wants to save him. And he almost kills him in that process to some degree. So that's a very interesting moment, because here we have this concept of help can go too far, but also in many ways Daniel did save him, because the guy didn't die at the same time, and if they waited for the police, who knows what would have happened. So that's like a very interesting issue to bring up, and really kind of walking a line with this. And I think this is a jumping off point for where the rest of this series goes to some degree.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what's kind of fun about calling it righteous, because the term righteous has some negative and some positive connotation to it. The basic concept of righteous, the definition, the dictionary definition, is simply doing the right thing. But righteous also has a negative connotation with it in the term self-righteous. And we often think of that term when we hear the word righteous. So naming it that was intentional, because there's never an absolute clear answer. But one thing that is true is that if you try to do the right thing, that most of the time it's going to work out fairly well. Yes, sometimes it's not. And you have to be prepared for that, be okay with that, and know that at least you tried. And you did it with unconditional love for all, rather than just selfishness. So I would rather show that the reality of the situation, rather than have it all nice and rosy, right? Than to and there's lessons that are still learned in that situation. And one of the things now, now I'm no longer a producer in the video game industry, and I don't do the comic book full time. It's still a part-time thing for me. But what I do now is I talk to people a lot about having a better life and overcoming their childhood traumas and adversity and so forth. And so when we look at a situation like that, we can say, okay, so that set off a chain reaction of events. Things did not go well with him and his wife after that, because he ditched the idea of going to this concert so that he could try to save and fail, sort of, saving the jumper on the bridge. And she's finally like, okay, I've had enough. I can't do this anymore. You're not the same guy that you used to be. And so we can look at that and we can go, oh, what a dumb decision that he made, right? But we can also look at it and say, actually, it needed to happen. They were so divergent in their own beliefs and views of the world now that wasn't necessarily going to be a good relationship. So it's probably for the best that split up occurred. And we can look at our own lives like that too. Even though something really negative has happened to us, we can look back and go, well, what happened as a result of that negative experience? Did something actually better happen in my life as a result? Did I learn some things that I wouldn't have learned? Did I get put in front of a new person that I've never met before and they turned out to be huge from another perspective, from a career, relationship, whatever? Um, so I think that it does a really nice job of introducing all of those concepts to the reader and allows us the opportunity to believe and have faith and confidence and optimism about anything that happens in our lives.
And to bring a point even further with that, clearly Diane, his wife, and him were going on separate paths. And
Yes.
they weren't going on separate paths at the start of the series, but clearly by issue 3, or chapter 3, I should say, they were going on separate paths. And I felt that an explosion needed to happen.
Yeah.
And we actually see in the later, and I'm going to ruin it a little bit, but I don't think it's much of a spoiler, that she is sort of getting treated the same way that she was treating her husband by her boss. And there's a very interesting line where he says, "Now that you're vice president, have you made me more money today?"
Right.
And it's a very interesting scene because it kind of shows a little bit of that extreme corporatism and that extreme and very toxic corporate environment.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying, in which I'll be honest, I'm not totally opposed against corporate environments, but that is a perfect example of toxic corporate environments.
Right.
And so it's very interesting that we sort of see even the back side of her story a little bit, and where this is coming from, and where Daniel was prior to this, or what I was assuming, or got the inference, I should say, where he was at. So I think that's a very nice touch in the book.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's fun because, obviously I was in the corporate world for 22 years. So I'm quite familiar with a lot of the different aspects and the things that you see. And it's always nice because I know a lot of the language, so the lingo is kind of correct and all that, which, that's just a fun side thing. But I know what it was like to be under pressure to make money, and that and what kind of impact that has on an individual. Instead of flowing and being your best, maybe now you're feeling a different type of pressure that may sway the way that you're making decisions, and you might make decisions that are not as good because you're just like thinking about the bottom line all the time.
It's
And
also
so,
pressure
okay.
with even delivery, even over money sometimes, in which that when you have a deadline, it changes the way things are done. It changes the way, just to drop a quick statistic, when people are happy and they're smiling, people actually think 31% faster than if they're in a negative state of mind. And there's been a lot of studies on this, and there's a study at Harvard that when you're in a negotiation with somebody, if you can make them smile and make them laugh and like you, the two of you are going to reach your end goal at better points and in a friendlier, faster way than if you're in a more hostile mood. And so that's just something very interesting. And I don't know if you knew that in the corporate world, but it's a very interesting study. But please continue because it was interesting what you were saying still.
No, that's awesome. And I really thank you for telling me that fact because I did not know that. And it's something that I actually work with my students essentially now on is moving to a happier place. I mean, I teach an online course called Defaulting to Happy. And so that's just even more ammunition, right, for saying, oh yeah, being in a happy state is a good thing. It's even a good thing from a cognition speed standpoint. So thank you.
From a money
And
standpoint as well. Even though,
right, sure. Yeah, you're gonna make faster, better decisions, right? So then, it's you stop reading probably at the end of chapter 5, right? And what
guilty.
happens in the next volume is that we see the main characters split off a little bit more. So now the story starts to follow Diane down her path as well as Daniel. So we get to explore more of the things that she's dealing with from a corporate standpoint, from her overbearing and very demanding and somewhat crazy CEO boss herself.
And that raises the question of balance of life, because that's what I got out of this book, is that that's what it was for me, and that's how I interpreted it, is that I didn't interpret it as going completely away from capitalism or even that way. I viewed it more as saying, okay, we need to have more balance in the corporate world, we need to have more balance in our personal lives, and we need to, kind of be a little bit nicer and a little bit nicer to ourselves sometimes as well in that realm. That's how I interpreted it. And that's the
Yeah.
nice thing about comics, is that you can interpret any which way you want, more so than
Right.
any other medium, and at least I think so. And so, but I think this book does, and the series really touches upon that concept and pushes that out. At least for me, it did. So I'm curious how you feel and how you conveyed that, because it's definitely in there.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting because, as you continue reading, you'll see more and more of a preference that the good guy characters kind of take, but they haven't necessarily succeeded in their preference. And it's hinted at the end, near the end of chapter 5. If you remember, they're playing croquet on the roof, right, at midnight, and
It's a nice little
and
touch.
Daniel's
It's a nice
yeah.
touch.
Yeah, and Daniel's like ranting over the fact that, like, why are we doing all these stupid things that that where we're not helping each other, and people are on the street, and we can build fleets of aircraft that carry people all over the planet. We can make farms that provide food so that every grocery store building in every state, in every city, in every corner always has enough food. Like, that's insanity, really, if you think about it. Go back to, like, say, the mid 1800s and get all the farmers together and go, yeah, this is what you're going to do. You're going to be like, yeah, right. Like, that's impossible, you crazy person. So, it's amazing what we've been able to accomplish. And if we can accomplish all of those things and, so many more, why can't we accomplish something where everybody is provided for? Why can't we just do that? If we just decided to do that, we certainly could. And why don't we? And so I do start to explore the answers to those questions as the story goes on. And that's part of the challenge of some of the characters, is like, how can we create a different system? How can we usher the world more toward a utopian society? Maybe this disease of making people want to help each other could be the assistance that we need to create that new society.
Well, I'm going to let people go pick up your book to get those answers. But before we do that, I do want to talk about the other side of this, which I think is just as interesting, and that's kind of behind the scenes, and that's the Kickstarter component of it and the actual publishing. Because one of the things, and a lot of people that I've interviewed in the indie space, are doing Kickstarter, and they're using
Yeah.
Kickstarter in a variety of ways. And so I don't know how you used Kickstarter, but you were successful for both of them.
Right.
For all of this, and it really kickstarted it. But some people use Kickstarter to actually get the funding to print it and publish it and put it out there. And other people have now started using Kickstarter almost as a pre-order form. And so I kind of want to talk about all of that and
Sure.
what drew you to doing it on Kickstarter, and what methodology were you using with Kickstarter, because Kickstarter has become the place to publish an indie comic, which
Yeah.
is what this fits into. Not to categorize it, but
Right. Well, it's important. I mean, I've done kind of both, I think, of those approaches. Um, so I started the comic while I was still working in the video game industry. So I had the funds, because I lived alone at that time, and I had a very inexpensive place that I lived in. So I was able to pay. I have artists that are working on this that are all over the world. I have my main illustrators in Spain, and my colorist is in Peru, and my letterers here in the U.S. So, and they're all professionals in the comic book industry. These are people that all have 10 years of experience plus at doing what they do. So, and I wanted it to be as professional as possible. And I even hired a professional editor from the industry who really helped me get started, because while I understood the language of storytelling, I didn't necessarily understand the language of comics. And so she was able to really help me, kind of like on the job training of showing me, oh, you can't end a scene in the middle of a page, and just all the little tricks and tips to creating comic books that I didn't necessarily know. So each page is expensive. Every page that you read in that comic book costs me money. And so I was able to, and continue to be able to, pay the artists for creating this using my own funds. And so when it comes time to do the Kickstarter, it's essentially paying me back for what I've spent, or trying to. It hasn't always done that. I'm still in the hole, but the idea is that with each one, I can get a portion at least of what I've spent, because to me, I have to tell this story. This story is so important to me that I don't care what it takes. I don't care if I have to be, driving Uber or whatever to make sure that I make enough money to create this comic series. It is a driving passion of mine. So, but the Kickstarter is a nice relief, because when I put it on there, I'm putting a number, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 or whatever for each volume is the target, and that gets me, a decent amount, a decent percentage of the amount that I've spent on that particular volume up to that point. So that works really well. And then, yeah, it does. It works as a what did you call it? A pre-order system for people that are interested in the next volume, because there's some people that like to read the physical copies. And so that way, that there's a little extra expense, of course, in having it printed. So that can be covered by the Kickstarter. But at the same time, they can go on my website and they can buy the physical copies, or they can download the digital copies, either one. So, yeah, I think it's all the above.
And to even further talk about that, because one of the things that I have spoken about with a lot of people who do Kickstarters is that it's almost motivational, because Kickstarter is extremely voluntary. It's completely voluntary, meaning
Yes.
that people choose and pick and say, hey, I want to support this project, and it's an all or nothing type thing. And in many ways, I've never had a Kickstarter, but what I hear is that when your project gets funded, that means that enough people care and want to see what happens next. And so what is that like for you as a creator, for tabling the money and the economic relief in publishing something, but even to know that people are willing to go out there and you have 150 backers or 100 backers who want to make this happen? Because that's a very cool thing, and that is a very new thing in comics. I mean, comics have been around for about 90 years on the main scene since really the 1930s, and we're now starting to see in the last 15 that indie comics actually, I don't want to say can compete, but have a seat at the table.
Right.
Is how I describe it. And Kickstarter is that seat.
Yeah, that's a good way to sum that up. I mean, and the basic concept is that what you're doing here is you're getting to evaluate whether your concept can be supported. So you put it up there, you describe it the best you can, and then if people say, yeah, that seems like something interesting to me, then it happens. But if not enough people say that's interesting to me, then it doesn't happen. And you could say, oh, okay, well, that idea isn't as good as maybe another one, and so you might try a different idea. The problem, though, of course, is that once again, we have to look back at, well, there's more to it than that. And it comes down to who's better at marketing their idea. So if your idea is just okay, but you're really good at marketing it, and you have a big mailing list, and you know all the right things and all the right buttons to push to get people to sign up, then you can be successful with an average idea. And somebody who has a fantastic idea but isn't a good marketer fails miserably. So it's not as good as it could be, but it is at least a step in the right direction.
And now I'm going to table that, because that's all I have for Kickstarter. But I want to talk about something that is more public, possibly a little bit political to some degree, and that's what's going on in the world right now. And in particular, COVID-19 has torpedoed and decimated entertainment, and it's leveled everybody out. And the comic world has been pretty much nuked at this point, to put it bluntly, on the con scene at the very least. And I don't know how many cons you go to, but what has it been like on the creator side and sales wise, and even just getting the idea out there? Because more people are at home, more people are online, but also printers are not printing, and there's a variety of other problems going on. So I'm very curious how you're handling and weathering that storm.
Well, yeah, I mean, normally I had a number of different expos and conferences that I was going to be going to over these last 2 months that were, of course, all canceled. And some of them were canceled till later in the year, and some of them were canceled for the year. And I travel around the country in a camper van going to these things to show off my stuff and to give talks and help people. I kind of do motivational speaking, I suppose you could say. And so the idea is that, yeah, that's a problem. Like I have a lot of physical copies of the comic in my van that haven't sold, that would have sold by now. But at the same time, on the other hand, it isn't much of an impact because I haven't had to buy anymore. So it's just stationary inventory that I know that once I get back on the road, it will resume. And so it's not a problem. Since my entire income is not dependent on sales of the comic book, it's not a big deal for me at all. And what's really fascinating, okay, you know that the characters are starting to call the righteousness experience in the book, they're calling it a disease, right? Because they don't really know what else to call it.
Timing.
Right. So they're calling it a disease. And what's really fascinating is that in the story that I'm writing, that I had written like 2 years ago, but we're just now getting to drawing it, we're in a quarantine situation. So it's almost exactly mirrored with the reality of the world right now. So, it's kind of awesome, really, at least until that comes out.
Ironic is what it's called.
Yeah. Well, I come from a world where we call it synchronicity.
That works too.
Yeah.
So even to go further off of this, because I'm very curious, because I'm in the con space. I present at a lot of cons. I'm in the DC area, and this is a rich con area, and everything's been canceled, and it really kind of sucks. I mean, to put it, and not to be too negative, and we're going to get through this. I've been saying this on every interview. COVID-19 is going to be addressed, and we're going to get back to normalcy at some point.
Yeah.
But I'm very curious, because you go to a lot of cons. I don't know if it's Comic-Cons or what type of conventions or expos you go to, but I think they're all the same as far as safety of attendees. And so I'm very curious, how do you think that these are going to change? And these type of entertainment situations are going to change going forward?
That's a great question. I think it's to be seen. And you were saying in some ways the entertainment industry has suffered, but in some ways I think it's thrived because people have nothing better to do but sit around and watch Netflix and read books and that sort of thing. So I don't think that it's all going down in flames. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. I don't subscribe to fear, but I also subscribe to unconditional love. So I don't want to put myself in a position where I could carry a disease, a sickness, onto someone else who would then suffer or die. So though I don't have any fear for myself, I don't really want to, be the one that puts people in harm's way, right?
You don't want to harm somebody. That's what it really amounts to, in which that you don't, and a lot of people I think in America feel that way right now, where a lot of people say, I don't think this is, I don't want to say it's not a big deal, it's a very infectious disease, but I don't think this is the most deadliest thing on the planet, but a bunch of people can be at risk who are in an at-risk group. Yes. And because it's so infectious, what winds up happening is that it's not just like a common cold where it takes a lot to get somebody sick. And so I think that's why a lot of people are wanting to stay home, even though their businesses and their paychecks are being at risk. And I think because they don't want to harm somebody. Like, I don't subscribe to fear, but I also have a little bit of a weaker immune system. And I haven't left my apartment because I know that if I get it, it's going to make my life difficult and it's going to harm me. And I think that that's where people are at. And that's what I get out of you.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, there probably will be some changes. There'll probably be some more testing that goes on, or some different sorts of rules, like, oh, you shouldn't hug everybody, or, I don't know. The kind of conferences I go to actually are metaphysics and spirituality conferences. And so there's lots of hugging that goes on because we are in a state of unconditional love for all. And so I've thought of that a few times, like, okay, what happens when I go back to these conferences and I want to give somebody a hug? Are they going to look at me with fear in their eyes and go, no, 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 we can't do that? Or is it going to be that I'm not allowed to? I don't know. I don't know how it's going to be yet, but I'm open-minded, and I also understand that everything always works out the way that it's supposed to, and for some great reason. And so even though this is a difficult time for many, this is an opportunity for people becoming woke. And if you think about 9/11, that was a weird situation where the world kind of slowed down, in many cases came to a halt. And there's a lot of people that point back to that time and say, that was the time that I realized that not everything was as it seemed. And that's actually a very good thing. So I often look at these negative, quote unquote, negative experiences that we have as some sort of indication of something great coming along the horizon. And we just can't possibly know what that's going to be yet.
And I think we're going to leave it at that, but I do want to give you an opportunity to promote yourself. You got this series, 14 chapters. I don't know when chapter 15, 16, and onward are coming. I know there's a lot more story to be told. And this story can go in a lot of ways, and you could probably have a few spin-offs as well at
Oh,
some
yeah, it
point.
would be so easy to spin it off. And I've definitely had some ideas about people somewhere else contracting it too, and then having it go from there. There's so many aspects of life. What if this happened to a police force? How would what would happen for them? What happens if it, happens in a hospital? How are the doctors going to treat patients? Is it going to be different? Like, there's so many different aspects of this that, yeah, it's going to be so much fun to explore it. And, I'm really, chapter 14 and 15 is still fairly early on to everything that's going on. There's so much more room to grow with this. And I'm excited to see where it's going to take us all. But yeah, so you can download the first issue of Righteous for free off my website. It's free.righteouscomic.com. And you'll sign up for my mailing list, which is generally fairly quiet, except if I'm going to be promoting something like the next Kickstarter, which would be wonderful for people to participate in. But at the very least, they can read the first issue, see if they like it, and then decide if they want to purchase copies off the website. And they get various offers and so forth by signing up for the mailing list. So I would encourage folks to do that. And yeah, I'm in talks with a couple of different producers in the Hollywood area in Canada also that are interested in turning it into a TV series or a movie. We're in very early stage discussions on that. And I think that would take it to the next level. Obviously, everybody watches TV series and movies, as opposed to what's the percentage of people that read comic books? It's somewhat low in comparison. So the possibility and the opportunities are there, and I'm going to continue to pursue those and see what happens.
And going beyond just the series and the issues that are out there and getting the free first chapter that can come, does Righteous have